Okay, welcome back, folks. This is your walkthrough video that is going to look at 3D on paper 3. That's the Weimar and Nazi Germany paper. This is probably going to be a two-part video just because this is quite a big question and I want to really show you an example of how you can get top marks on this question. So I've pre-written what would probably get you 15 or 16 marks if you were to do this question in an exam. So I can really talk you through the intricacies of this question, what kind of checkpoints you need to be hitting as you're writing this, and really how much you should be looking to write. So we're going to start off just by looking at the question itself. And we're going to do what we always do. We're going to start off by highlighting the focus of the question. Always comes at the end of that first sentence. This is what we're supposed to be talking about. And you'll hopefully know by now that section B of the Germany paper, each of the parts of section B, so 3A, 3B, 3C, and 3D, they all have the same focus. So in this case, all of those questions are talking about the challenges facing the Weimar Republic in the years 1919 to 23. So we see that consistency. And like I've said before, 3A, 3B, 3C, and 3D, they all build on one another. So by the time you get to 3D, you should have a really good knowledge of what your two sources are telling you and what your two interpretations are telling you as well. So with that in mind, I've got the two interpretations from this paper here. Again, we know that they're going to be talking to us about challenges that the Weimar government faced in that early period, 1919 to 1923. So this is any problems that the Weimar Republic faced and maybe why it was an issue for the Weimar Republic as well. Now, we know these two interpretations are going to contrast. They're, in this case, going to give us different types of challenge. So these two interpretations disagree on what the biggest challenge was for the Weimar Republic. Now, I've already done some work with these. I've taken the liberty of going through already and highlighting the parts that tell me what that challenge was. So if we look at interpretation one, it says, and we can get rid of this, we don't need the provenance for these interpretations, so please do this on your papers as well. So looking for anything that proves what the challenge was, why there was a challenge, anything to do with problems that the Weimar government faced. So it says, some democratic parties did support the Weimar Republic, so we probably know this is going to be talking about politics. However, powerful political groups on both the left and the right refused to accept the existence of the Weimar Republic. Okay, now using my own knowledge, I know that here they're probably talking about the Spartacists, and I know that here they're probably talking about the Cat Putsch. Remember, that's one of the sources on this paper as well. And they're probably talking about the Munich Putsch as well, because that was definitely a right-wing attempt at a revolution. So this is focusing on political upheaval, isn't it, and political instability. So these groups on the left and right refused to accept the existence of the Weimar Republic. They were prepared to destroy it by force and replace it with their own form of government. So what I'm doing is I'm selecting quotes here with my highlighter that I think might come in useful later. These are quotes that tell me something about A, who was presenting the challenge, and B, just how significant that challenge was. And you can see that here with the last thing I've highlighted. This made it difficult for the new government to maintain order and govern Germany. That's telling me just how serious this challenge was. I've then done the exact same thing with interpretation 2, and remember, we know that they're gonna differ. So if this one is talking about political unrest and claiming that that is one of the biggest challenges, this one, as we can see here, is saying that hyperinflation forced the Weimar government to fear for its own existence. So this one is focusing on hyperinflation as the key challenge. Okay, but it doesn't just stop there. It then goes on to talk about the French occupation of the Ruhr and how the government couldn't really find a solution to that. They printed more money and then this ruined the economy. So again, I'm really highlighting anything here which tells me what the challenge was and just how serious that challenge was. We can see when it says this ruined the economy, that tells me how serious this challenge is. People talked openly about removing the government by popular revolution or military purge. Again, it's talking about the seriousness of this challenge, isn't it? Now, with question 3D, this is a judgment question. As you can see, it says, how far do you agree with interpretation 2? Now, I should have hopefully by this point, decided which one of these I might support more. Now, there are two ways that you can work this out. You can either do yourself a little grid and say, okay, we've got interpretation 2 over here, and then over here we've got other challenges. Now, if you want, you can do a little list of things that support that. So over here, other challenges, you've got political unrest, you've got weak constitution. Sorry, my writing's terrible. Weak constitution, proportional representation, Article 48, all that stuff. Then you could even get in here Dolstos theory. That was a challenge, wasn't it? People did not always support the government because they believed that they'd stab the military in the back. And over here, you've got hyperinflation. I'm just going to note there, hyperinflation, Ruhr crisis, and probably from that, or from both of these, the Munich Putsch, because the putsch probably wouldn't have happened if it weren't for those two things. So I've got to make a decision to what extent I think that interpretation 2 is accurate, that the key challenge to Weimar was hyperinflation and the Ruhr crisis. Now, I do believe that hyperinflation was the biggest challenge to Weimar during this period, and I have to now prove that. I have to have a criteria that proves why this is more of a significant challenge than this. If you have yourself a criteria like that, you're going to get top marks on this question. Now, the question mentions interpretation 2, so that's our key interpretation. That's the one that we need to start with. Okay, it does say here though, explain your answer using both interpretations and your knowledge. So we need to make sure that we do both of those things. In order to make sure that we get all of the marks here, we're going to use JSOC. What that means is we're going to hit the examiner first with our judgment. So that comes after we've looked at our little plan and said, actually, yeah, I think I do agree with interpretation 2. So my judgment is that I do mostly agree with interpretation 2 in this case. Okay, and we always want to balance our language here by saying mostly or partially, somewhat, that kind of thing, because then it allows you to give your opposing view. Okay, so this is part of this this question. You must first of all support the interpretation in the question. So you first of all give all of the evidence that you have to prove that interpretation 2, and in this case hyperinflation, was a really significant challenge. You then have to put on a different hat, or put on a different pair of shoes, however you want to think about it, and say, okay, well, if I were arguing the opposite, how would I do that? And then you want to literally do that. So you then need to say, okay, well, there are other challenges as well, though, in this case. For example, as it says in interpretation 1, remember, we need to use both interpretations. There was political unrest. We know that there was a weak constitution, Article 48, political proportional representation, and Dolstos theory. Okay, and then you finish off, and this is really only for those people going for the top grades. So you're looking for your grade 7s, your grade 8s, your grade 9s. You must have a criteria, so a reason why your argument is more important than the opposing argument. So why do you agree with interpretation 2 and not interpretation 1 in this case? Okay, this is your structure. Now, I'm going to now talk you through what that might look like, and I've pre-written my own answer. You're going to have to do your best to read it because my writing isn't always the best. This first section here is where I make my judgment. This will get you a mark just by itself. And in fact, you can't get really much more than half marks. In fact, you can't even really get half marks without making a judgment. It's really low down in the marking criteria as something that you must do. So I'll talk you through what I've written. While other challenges undoubtedly existed, so I'm balancing my language here. While other challenges undoubtedly existed for the Weimar Republic, I agree to a large extent with interpretation 2. So that part there, that's my judgment. That's where I stand. That's the side of the argument that I'm coming down on. I agree with interpretation 2. And we can even add here, interpretation 2 is about hyperinflation. Okay, I agree that that is the biggest challenge facing Weimar in this period. So I agree to a large extent with interpretation 2 that it was hyperinflation caused by the government's response to the Ruhr occupation that was the greatest challenge in this period. All right, it doesn't need to be quite as detailed as what I've done there. If you're going for those top grades, this is what you need to be aiming for. But as long as you get that judgment and explain it a little bit here, that's perfect. Okay, so we can tick that off. We've done our judgment. We then, if we look at our little matrix here, we've done our judgment. We then need to support interpretation 2. Okay, so this is where we're building our argument, because we've said that we agree to a large extent with interpretation 2. So we really need to argue the case for interpretation 2 here. We start off by discussing what interpretation 2 is telling us, providing some quotes, and then supporting that with our own knowledge of the period. So I've got a little key up here as well, because we want to be seeing these 3 things. Number 1, I want to be making links to the interpretation. So I want to be quoting the interpretation, talking about what it says in the interpretation. I also then want to support it with my own knowledge. So we've got blue, green, and then black here is anywhere where I'm referencing that criteria, referring back to why I think this. So here we go. Get my colours ready. So I've got my green, I've got my blue, and I've got my black. Okay. Interpretation 2 details the Weimar government's disastrous response to the Ruhr invasion by the French in January 1923. Okay, so I'm linking to the interpretation there, aren't I? I'm not directly quoting it yet, but I'm certainly saying I know what it's about. As the occupation drained the German economy, the Weimar government became desperate and so decided to simply print more paper money. Direct quote, so I'm linking back, in order to keep the economy afloat, as well as pay striking workers. So I'm kind of telling the story of hyperinflation while linking back to interpretation 2. In order to keep the economy afloat, as well as pay striking workers, this proved to be have a disastrous impact on the entire German population, except maybe farmers. Now that's some of my own knowledge, isn't it? I know that farmers weren't quite as affected, so I'm supporting this interpretation with something that I know myself. As the German mark began to lose value, again, that's my own knowledge, I know that it began to lose value, and as interpretation 2 states, so that's a direct link, interpretation 2 states, ruin the economy. So can you see how I'm blending in discussion about the interpretation and then backing it up throughout with my own knowledge? Interpretation 2 is entirely accurate when it states the drastic impact of the government's choice to print more money. Turn page. To fill this hole. The situation became so drastic that by November 1923, a simple loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. That is my own knowledge. Okay, so I'm really sort of developing interpretation 2 here, aren't I? And I'm really supporting it and backing it up. The rich weren't even spared as their savings became worthless. Again, that's my own knowledge supporting the interpretation as to why it was so impactful. And eventually, the mark dropped in value so significantly that many Germans began using paper money for fuel. Okay, so can you see what I'm doing here? I'm saying what the interpretation is telling me, and I'm then supporting it. I'm really doubling down with my own knowledge and making it seem like this is the better side of the argument. All of this led, as interpretation 2 quite rightly states, to a thirst for popular revolution, direct quote, or a military putsch. Indeed, this is what happens in November 1923 as the NSDAP, led by Hitler, attempt just that. Okay, again, supporting with my own knowledge. The Weimar government were right to fear for its own existence. And if we look back at our interpretation, okay, we can see that that is a direct quote. Government fear for its own existence. So I've got this lovely blended paragraph. This lovely blended paragraph that is littered with direct links to the interpretation where I'm discussing it, and then I'm backing it up with support from my own knowledge. That is the first 2 steps of JSOC complete. So I've given my judgment in my introduction. I've then supported interpretation 2 by telling what it's all about, giving direct quotes, and then supporting that with my own knowledge. The next video will show you how to give the opposing view and to work your criteria into there to support your argument the best. Okay, so now if you could have a look at video 2.